Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining me once again for some nightly musing on... Yeah, I still don't know what this is. So, a lot has happened since I posted my thoughts on the Rings of Power, and if you've subscribed in the last year, you might have noticed that I've been eerily silent on new reveals, trailers, news, and interviews. The honest reason for this is that I just post much more slowly than other channels interested in these sorts of things. But I will say that I did intentionally withdraw myself from this whole controversy for the purpose of clarity and focus. Ultimately, when it comes down to it, I don't view this as a commentary channel. Both Siegfried, the bigger, beardier person who narrates the stories, and myself want this channel to be dedicated to the art of storytelling and criticism about storytelling. And therefore, I refuse to be absorbed into the pop cultural pandemonium of constantly commenting on current events. Because of this, I must regret to inform you that I will not be reviewing this show. So I got my younger brother to do it instead. Leif, wake up.
What do you want?
Didn't you want to talk about the Rings of Power?
Yeah. So are you finally ready to listen to my theory that Galadriel in the show is actually a reincarnation of Luthien?
No, not that. I wanted you to spend the time that I couldn't commenting on what's happened since I posted my last video, and possibly also to comment on each episode of the Rings of Power.
Yeah, I can do that.
Just don't be too absurd in your discussion.
Fine. It's not like you're never absurd in your discussions. Yeah, doesn't matter. He's already gone. So, hello everybody. My name is Leif. I'm the youngest of the three brothers. My older brothers are Harald and Siegfried, but I'm sure you already knew that. Yes, I know that the audio and visual quality of this video is absolutely awful. My excuse is that I just moved in to a new place, and I bought a microphone from Amazon. Unfortunately, they knew that I was going to be doing this, and so it won't arrive until after the first Rings of Power episode. There we are. A little bit of a fun fact about me. I've been asking to be on the channel for a while, mostly because I'm the only one who's attractive enough not to be represented by a cartoon character that looks like it was drawn by an 8th grader. And here I am. So if you've watched my brother's video, you probably have a good understanding of where I stand on the show. Adaptation is fine, but you have to show some level of respect to the creator of the work you're adapting, especially when it comes to pulling off what they were trying to do with their story. Also, now that I've made my position more clear, I'd like to levy a little bit of a request, I guess you could call it, from the YouTube commentary community, which I guess I'm now a part of. Shut up for like a week, please? One of the most annoying things that has happened over the past 5 months is me having to constantly see another Lord of the Rings of Power gets wrecked, destroyed, ratioed, whatever other indication of disapproval by Tolkien fans video pop up in my feed by the same 5 channels, non-stop. And now, I know what you're going to say, but Leif, you were the one who got yourself into that by watching those videos and thus forcing the YouTube algorithm to recommend them to you. And I don't have a cogent response to that other than to say that, yes, I know, but it's still kind of annoying. Because what this whole trend has done is it's created a large group of people who are parroting the exact same totally wrong, inaccurate, or misleading information all across the internet. And no one is willing to correct them about that information for fear of seeming like they're defending the show. I, however, don't care about my reputation, since I don't have one. Yet. And therefore, I'd just like to point out 3 things before we get started. 1. Tolkien did not create a mythology for England. That's not what Middle-earth is, that's not what the Silmarillion is, and that's not what the Lord of the Rings is. He certainly intended to do so early on in his career, and that initial attempt at mythology was what would eventually develop into the Silmarillion. But it's a concept he seems to have abandoned shortly after finishing the Book of Lost Tales and moving past them. 2, there's no such thing as the Tolkien canon in the strict sense of that word outside of, I guess, Lord of the Rings. And yes, I am being absolutely serious. Tolkien, being the perfectionist he was, would often go back and change stuff with Silmarillion and even the Second Age, and he did that up until the very end of his life. And so, to call almost anything that Tolkien wrote canon seems a little bit of a stretch of the semantic meaning of that word beyond its usual limits. I much more prefer the term lore, since that's a bit broader, and it still captures the problems people are having with the handling of Tolkien's world. Because regardless of whether or not Tolkien codified a canon, the world and characters he created still had a definite shape outside of the things that he was constantly tweaking throughout his life. And 3, the amount of people who are basing their understanding of Tolkien's world off of the Peter Jackson movies rather than anything Tolkien wrote has created an entire section of the anti-Amazon group who have no idea what they're talking about. I know we've all decided to hate Corey Olsen for his comments in the IGN interview, but to be honest, he's kind of right. I see way too many people in comments on various trailers and interviews talking about how Elrond doesn't look like Hugo Weaving, and how Galadriel was way cooler when she fought Sauron, or parroting Gandalf's quote about ordinary people holding back evil in unexpected journey. To be fair, it's a great quote, just not something that Tolkien wrote. Alright, so with all that stuff out of the way, let's talk about what you guys really came for, which is the Rings of Power. I was leaving out some level of hope that the creators and the producers and the showrunners, or whoever you want to blame for this, was going to, actually try to adapt Tolkien's works, and maybe the next few trailers weren't going to be that bad. However, what became more clear as more and more information came out is that this is just going to be another trash fire. Which isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. Trash fires are actually fairly entertaining to watch, as long as they're not burning copies of Lord of the Rings. The main problem for me is that I'm now convinced I'm going to be seeing just enough cool stuff for things like the Two Trees, or the War of Wrath, or, I don't know, Numenor itself, and I'm going to really enjoy that, but then I'm going to have any enjoyment of that squelched from me when I'm forced to endure another dialogue session between fake Elrond and fake Galadriel. Speaking of which, there was one comment which actually attempted to give criticism of Harold's video. Most everyone else just seemed to be complimenting his voice. Oh well. And it pointed out that Tolkien actually did view Elrond as politically ambitious because he was really involved with people like Gil-galad, and Galadriel was a warrior princess in Tolkien's mind because of her being, super strong, and she fought a battle in the First Age. Okay, so yes, Tolkien, literally at the end of his life, did decide to include Galadriel on the Defender's side in the kinslaying of Alquilande. He then died shortly after conceiving this idea, and as such, it is contained in almost none of his notes that he had about the battle, and as far as I've been able to find, is only referenced briefly in Morgoth's Ring, and is only told in full in Unfinished Tales. So, here's my problem with this argument. We don't know what Galadriel was doing in this battle, though, to be fair, she was almost certainly fighting. We don't know if Tolkien really intended for this warrior Galadriel to carry through the rest of the First Age, let alone into the Second Age. Most of all because of the fact that this whole idea wasn't to make Galadriel into a warrior princess. It was to remove her from any form of guilt of Feanor's rebellion. Most importantly, because Tolkien never actually had the time to integrate this idea into the rest of his writings, we have no idea whether or not he would have rejected it, and that's certainly possible. Remember that Tolkien wasn't really that big of a fan of war or being a warrior for its own sake. That was kind of the entire point of Faramir and Éowyn's story. In light of this, there is actually a way to salvage the whole warrior Galadriel thing, and that's by having her character arc throughout the show be that she learns to give up on being a warrior. Maybe an indication of this is even given in the last trailer, given that she seems to break down in frustration whenever the suggestion that she shouldn't be a warrior comes up. Who knows? I don't have high hopes. Could happen. Still not what happened with her character in the Second Age, though, but I suppose that's a separate issue now. It's a similar problem with the defense of how they're portraying Elrond. Yes, he's politically ambitious if you stretch the meaning of the word politically to mean anything having to do with the governance of a large group of people, and the word ambitious meaning having to do with something. But generally when someone describes someone else as being politically ambitious, what they mean is that the person has the specific intention of using his political power or political institutions as a mean of gaining greater power and influence over a larger group of people, and usually for personal gain. Thus, we could say someone like Donald Trump or King Louis XIV, for instance, because they both use their respective political institutions to gain greater power and influence. Whereas someone like a King Louis IX or Queen Elizabeth II probably aren't. Now, you could still argue that they are in fact politically ambitious, but whether they are or aren't has nothing to do with how interconnected they are with the politics of their time. It's how do they use that interconnectedness to further an ambition. And what we know of Elrond in the Second Age shows that he wasn't politically ambitious. At all. He seems perfectly content with his rule of Rivendell, and he doesn't seem to be trying to gain any more land or power. And he seems perfectly content with his subordination under Gil-galad, who is the High King of the Noldor and Sindar. And yes, I'm fully aware of the Other Minds and Hands passage. I have the second edition of the Silmarillion just like everyone else. We're gonna have to talk about that line, aren't we? So, here's the thing. Every single anti-Amazon YouTuber has already pointed out the fact that the passage ends with absurd, and that he's describing a hypothetical rather than what his actual desire is at the time of writing the letter. Despite this, I actually think I have something to add to this discussion. On the one hand, it's certainly true that this passage comes from before Tolkien published Lord of the Rings, and was specifically in reference to his plans for Middle-earth while writing the Book of Lost Tales, rather than the writing for the Second Age, The Hobbit, or really anything related to the Lord of the Rings. Furthermore, even if Tolkien still wanted other writers to be creating work within his world, it's highly doubtful whether he thought the Second Age was the proper time period for this sort of expansion. It's been pointed out that he thought the Second Age was overall very dark time for the peoples of Middle-earth, and that there were very few stories there worth telling. Finally, there's a major difference between Other Minds and Hands adding to the parts of the general framework that Tolkien left vague or vacant of action, with new stories that coincide within that general framework, and reconstructing a story that Tolkien had already made so that it has nothing to do with how he made it. Few object to the bit of fan fiction about Frodo's first experiences in Valinor alongside Galadriel and Gandalf, primarily because Tolkien left that part of the story vague and unwritten, so speculation about it is fine. Does anyone honestly believe that if someone were to change the last chapter of The Lord of the Rings so that Elrond was secretly an evil mastermind and he kills the hobbits and Galadriel and Gandalf, that would at all be appropriate? All in all, I think the fact that this line keeps getting used as a justification for everything that they're doing with the show is getting unbelievable at this point. However, even with all these things in mind, I still think that the anti-Amazon case is being overplayed. First off, it's very clear that Tolkien is being self-deprecating in this letter, and it seems much more likely that he was calling this absurd not because he had come to disagree with it as a matter of principle, but rather that he viewed it as a childish fantasy, which was simply impractical in the end. Because of this, it's unlikely that he would have been totally against other people adding to his work full stop. Furthermore, the idea that Tolkien positively didn't want anyone to add to his work or change anything runs completely contrary to the idea that he wanted to create a mythology for England, which is a line that the purists are constantly parroting without actually thinking about what it means. It's an essential aspect of any mythology, especially the Germanic mythology which Tolkien was primarily imitating, that other authors add to and retell the stories. To give just one example, The Legend of the Nibelungs has a version contained both in the prose and poetic Edda, a medieval German version called the Nibelunglied, as well as several German, Icelandic, and Scandinavian retellings throughout the second millennium, culminating in probably the most well-known version with Wagner's Ring Cycle. Interestingly, Tolkien also tried his hand at retelling a part of the story with the legend of Sigurd and Gudrun, showing that he does view this as a part of mythology and was willing to contribute to it. This is why I think the whole argument should really steer away from the Tolkien created mythology for England thing. And it should focus more on what Tolkien himself thought was appropriate when it came to adapting his works. Because regardless of whether or not Tolkien created a mythology for England, and regardless of whether or not he set a specific canon, and regardless of whether or not he even would have wanted other minds and hands to add to his work, what is certain is that he did have a very particular vision for the things that he actually did set down and write. And sure, he tweaked those things throughout his life, but for the most part, there's a very strong consistency in the stories, and especially once you get to the stories of the Second Age. He may very well have enjoyed a novel-long story about what the Blue Wizards were doing to undermine or assist Sauron's power in the East, though he likely wouldn't have considered it appropriate to make it part of the main story. What is certain, however, is that he had a very high view of the story as he made it, much the same way as I'm sure Michelangelo felt about the Sistine Chapel, though, granted, obviously Lord of the Rings is better. Moving to a different subject, it's really impressed me just how consistently the marketing team has managed to portray the notion that this is going to be absolutely awful. Now, look, I don't like the fact that the whole race-swapping thing and the bearded dwarf lady thing, but we're going to ignore that, ended up becoming the front-runner of criticism and suspicion about the show. But the fact remains that it is an indication that you're going to be ignoring the world of the story the same way turning half the characters in the Canterbury Tales into Hispanics would be. And ultimately, while both I and my brother thought that the whole race-swapping thing was a secondary issue at best, the fact remains that it wasn't the fans who made this about the race and gender diversity. It was the showrunners and the cast.
or the marketing team, pick your poison. It was displayed as one of the selling points of the show, and is still being displayed as one of the selling points of the show. And if the selling point of the show is that you're going to be casting non-white actors, something which takes literally zero effort or talent to do, that's an indication of a bad show. And it only really makes it look like you're using minorities and women as a shield for your crappy production and writing quality. Now, if they wanted to show that their real intention was to adapt Tolkien, there were a couple of ways they could have done this. For one, what they probably should have done was simply release another trailer which shows us a bunch of classic moments and places from the Second Age, such as Middle Tarma, or even showing the Númenóreans coming to Middle-earth on their ships. And I'm ignoring things like the forging of the Rings of Power, which we're almost certain are going to be in the story. But more importantly, I'm ignoring things like the invasion of Valinor by the Númenóreans, the sinking of Valinor, the War of the Last Alliance, and things like that, because we know that that's probably going to be towards the end of the series, rather than something they're going to show in the first season. Another option would have been to show more scenes of Elrond ruling in Rivendell, or an argument between one of the faithful Númenóreans or one of those people who were seduced by Sauron. Or even any indication by any of the dialogue in any of the trailers that the philosophical and thematic underpinnings of the reality of death or the decay of Middle-earth was what caused Sauron's rise to power in the first place. Instead, what we got was cringy dialogue.
It is over.
You have not seen what I've seen.
I have seen my share.
You have not seen what I have seen.
A further use of what I hope to God is not the thematic underpinning of the Hobbits, I mean the Harfoots.
Away I must wander this wandering day.
The same footage, repeated, over and over again. This thing. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, this one's just funny. Emphasis on Meteor Man, which everyone feels certain is one of the Astari, which, if true, oh boy. And then, worst of all, we have another final trailer, which gets just about as close as you possibly could to confirming that this is no more than a bastardization of everything that Tolkien wrote about the Second Age. We have an utter mangling of what Tolkien wrote about Galadriel, not just simply in the First Age. Even in the battle, I never would have imagined Galadriel yelling out, "There is a tempest in me!"
There is a tempest in me!
And to be honest, with this last trailer, I don't even really know what to say about this, other than the fact that the fake scale armor of the Númenóreans is stupid, and it should have either been actual scale armor or just regular plate. The fact that Galadriel is dismissing the notion of fate or destiny is kind of concerning, because I don't think they were trying to extend the whole Bilbo was meant to find the ring idea. Though, to be fair, maybe that's what she meant by...
Ours was the work of something greater.
I guess Disa is going to be some sort of mentor to whatever the other dwarf's name is. I don't know. I don't care. Which is fine, I guess. I wish I knew actually what the character was, other than the fact that...
Female dwarf, female dwarf, female dwarf, female dwarf, female dwarf, female dwarf, female...
I wanted to close off the trailer discussion by saying that I have so many questions about what Galadriel and everyone else is even doing. This appears to be Númenor. Why is she even there? But, you know, I'll wait until the show comes out at this point. And also, I did just want to say that this all looks amazing, though admittedly I've never been much of a critic of visuals in movies or shows. The only thing I really enjoyed about this trailer was actually the comments, which were really funny, though mine didn't seem to make any headway. It's honestly impressive that we know basically nothing about the show minutes before it comes out. And what we do know about it seems completely antithetical to everything that Tolkien wrote about the Second Age, other than the most basic simplification of basic events. And yes, I did use the word basic twice. I can't speak properly. We're talking about the Rings of Power. However, in case that last point wasn't clear enough, here are 5 things that I am certain will happen in the Rings of Power. Mostly. 1, we'll have a recounting of the events of the First Age. 2, Galadriel and Miriel will be doomsayer characters who are dismissed only to turn out to be correct in the end. 3, the Rings of Power will be forged. 4, Sauron will rise to power and prove to be the big baddie. Who would have thought? And 5, Númenor will be a Calabeth at some point in the future. And to be honest, that last one is, at best, a maybe based on everything we've been shown. Ignoring the fact that this portrayal of Galadriel and Miriel has absolutely nothing to do with what they were in Tolkien's world, allow me to explain why only following this bare-bones structure is a problem. Events in a story or in history are almost never meaningful in and of themselves, but rather are meaningful due to the context in which they occur. Similarly, the events of the Second Age weren't meaningful in Tolkien's story because they happened. They were meaningful because of the context in which they took place. The First Age was meaningful because it showed the dangers of loving one's creations too dearly, and how envy and the desire to subjugate others to your rule leads to misery. But it also set up a wonderful dichotomy for the elves, especially in their relation to Middle-earth. Elves are immortal, and they love all the beautiful things that they see in the world, especially those things which aren't in Valinor, and they enjoy the relative freedom from the Valar. But they're also distressed by the endless decay of the world such that they end up dying in sorrow. This, in turn, is what leads to the reason for why the Rings of Power were forged in the first place. The elves wanted a means to preserve the things of the Middle-earth so that they might not decay, nor the elves pass away due to sorrow. In other words, they wanted the freedom from the Valar and the beauty that Middle-earth offered, but they also wanted the eternal preservation and beauty in Valinor. Their solution was to use their craftsmanship to overcome this dichotomy, allowing Sauron to seize the opportunity to gain power over them. The downfall of Numenor, likewise, wasn't meaningful because it was the downfall of a civilization. It played on the inevitability of death as well as the human abhorrence of it, and how attachment to this world is an incredibly dangerous thing for any civilization to undergo. This, again, is how Sauron was able to use his power and influence to bring down his enemies. And what's annoying about this is that if they don't tell this story, they'll not only prove themselves incapable of properly adapting Tolkien's writings, but they'll also have missed a great opportunity to outdo Jackson when it comes to the adaptation game. Because this whole dynamic that I just described is almost completely absent from the film trilogy, where it once stood prominent in places like the Council of Elrond and in the other interactions people were having with elves and the people of Gondor. And my reason for offering this outline is because I've gotten the impression that most other videos which I've commented here haven't really offered much in the way of what the showrunners should be. We've had hints of it, such as suggesting other, more legitimate ways of integrating a diverse cast into the show, rather than merely race-swapping the characters, but for the most part, all I've seen is complaints about how they aren't adapting Tolkien's writings properly, which I agree with, and I'm not saying the complaints weren't provoked. I'm simply saying that they're getting annoying and repetitive and not really productive at this point. In either case, I hope that even those who defend the show by hiding behind the Tolkien estate had veto power excuse will at least be able to agree that the show should be trying to generally capture these aspects of the Second Age. Because, again, that's ultimately what adapting a work should be about. Capturing the spirit and ideas behind that work, or even the plot and character interactions in order to make them available to new audiences or to give a different perspective on the same concept. The problem is that no member of the cast or the production team seems to be viewing it with that mindset. Now, I had two reasons really for releasing this video at this point. The first is mostly that I became worried that people were going to have a sort of frog in heating water effect. You know, the one where all the cavalcading portents of dreadfulness keep washing over people so long that people just kind of get numb to it. Looking back now, I'm not sure that this fear was really justified. If anything, Tolkien fans have become even more bitter as time went on. But the other reason I had for making this video was that, honestly, I've dedicated so many bursts of frustration and erratic thought to a show that hasn't even come out yet, that I really just needed to dedicate some time and effort to putting my thoughts on a page. The fact that I only recently realized it was coming out at the beginning of September rather than in November was horrifying. The distance made it so much easier to process what was going to happen, but now the weight of the situation has been pressing itself upon me more heavily with each passing day. And so, I thought now would be a good time for us all to just mentally prepare ourselves for the Rings of Power. I know many of you have probably been doing that for months or even years now, perhaps ever since it was announced that Amazon had acquired the rights. Furthermore, I know that many of you have already become jaded with things like the Star Wars sequel trilogy, Phase 4 of Marvel, the Wheel of Time adaptation, and Season 8. For me, it's a bit different. I enjoyed all those stories, though give me a few more books before I decide on the Wheel of Time. But compared to the formative impact that Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's Legendarium has had on me as a person, those other stories honestly don't even mean anything to me. There's a reason for why watching something you love get desecrated can hurt more than almost any physical pain you can endure. Pain and pleasure, ultimately, don't really affect you in the long run. But there are certain stories which can prove to you a world of such surpassing beauty and truth that they can shape your perspective, give your life meaning, and make you a better person in the process. The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion have honestly been like that for me.
And knowing that I'm going to watch everything that I love about them just get absolutely obliterated in a few days, it's more soul-crushing than any other example of Hollywood greed destroying all that was good and beautiful in the world. At least for me. And yet, I think I'm ready.